What is up, guys? We are back with another video. Okay, so for today's review, we have, as you can see in the title, Anthony Bourdain, Kitchen Confidential. So, I'm a huge Anthony Bourdain fan, and I have been for years. But I never actually read any of his books. I was a fan from his shows, and I used to watch a lot of interviews with him too, because to me he's such an interesting guy. So, but I never actually read any of his books, even though those were the things that put him on the track of becoming famous, and he got those shows because of his books, especially because of this book, Kitchen Confidential. So I was really excited to read this finally. I heard a lot of good things. I was super pumped to read this, and it did not disappoint. I really liked this book. Basically, it's a memoir. He wrote it in, I think, the year 2000. At that point, he was 44 years old. So he first wrote one chapter, which it ended up being one chapter in the final book. But he didn't write it with a book in mind. He wrote one chapter to then be sent to some New York magazine. They never responded, so while he was waiting, he sent that same little short story about life in the kitchen or whatever as a chef, and he sent it to the New Yorker. They called him back. They published that story. After that point, a publisher called him. They said, "Hey, we want a whole book like this," and the rest is history. He wrote the book, and he wrote it in mind for just other chefs, to make them laugh and have them relate to something like this. And you can tell when you're reading this book, because he makes a lot of references to just cuisine and cooking and things that I didn't even know, a lot of them, what he was saying. But I learned a lot from this book. And this book blew up once it came out. It became a New York Times bestseller. Then he got those shows, and then he became a celebrity. But this book is super interesting. Basically, he just goes into how what we think life is like inside the kitchen, it's actually quite different. And it's kind of like a pirate ship, like all these people working together, yelling at each other, cursing at each other. There's people having sex in the kitchen. There's people doing meth, doing all kinds of drugs. There are a lot of druggies in the restaurant business. He goes into how most restaurants fail because they aren't run right. The employees aren't doing things right. And he said 1 out of 4 restaurant fails super quick. And he worked in a lot of restaurants as a chef, tons. And he was on drugs for most of the time. And he goes into that in this book. So let's start off with a quote from within the first 100 pages. In this part, he's talking about the stress of living life as working in a restaurant and running a restaurant. And with every dime you've got tied up in your new place, suddenly the drains in your prep kitchen are backing up with raw sewage, pushing hundreds of gallons of impacted crap into your dining room. Your coke-addled chef just called that Asian waitress who's working her way through law school expletive, which ensures your presence in court for the next 6 months. Your bartender is giving away the bar to underage girls from Wantag, any one of whom could then crash Daddy's Buick into a busload of divinity students, putting your liquor license in peril, to say the least. The Ansel system could go off, shutting down your kitchen in the middle of a $10,000 night. There's the ongoing struggle with rodents and cockroaches, any one of which could crawl across the Tina Brown foretop in the middle of the dessert course. You just bought $10,000 worth of shrimp when the market was low, but the walk-in freezer just went on the fritz, and naturally it's a holiday weekend, so good luck getting a service call in time. The dishwasher just walked out after arguing with the busboy, and they need glasses now on table 7. Immigration is at the door for a surprise inspection of your kitchen's green cards. The produce guy wants a certified check, or he's taking back the delivery. You didn't order enough napkins for the weekend. And is that the New York Times reviewer waiting for your hostess to stop flirting and notice her? So just in that one really extensive paragraph, he's going into the stress just adding up and how, yeah, it makes sense how most of these people, especially head chefs, are like really messed up in the head and usually on something, some sort of drug or substance, because look at all this shit they got to deal with, And it just never ends. They work really long days, 12-hour days, 13-hour days, open to close. And then by that point, at the end, like, you're so tired, but you're also so, like, fried, mentally just wired. So you probably end up just drinking a lot. And he goes into that in this book, how he has had substance issues throughout his whole career as a chef, as well as most chefs that he knows. So, yeah, super interesting. Let's go to the next quote. So, something I noticed throughout this book is he makes a lot of jokes about death. And we know, unfortunately, what happened with him. He committed suicide. He hanged himself. And so to read this from years ago, almost 20 years ago, and he makes a lot of jokes about suicide, and he talks about suicide lightheartedly, it's almost weirdly like a foreshadowing of what happened. So here's one quote about it. He's talking about how he had a meeting with his boss, the owner of a restaurant, when he was pretty young, and he was working really long overtime hours every day, and he hated his life. He was going to quit. And the boss sat him down. He said, "Why do you want to quit?" He's like, I want to have a life outside of here. I have a girlfriend. I haven't actually talked to her in months. I just go home after work, sleep, then wake up and come back." And so the owner says, "Oh, that's okay. I have a wife. I haven't actually talked to her in years, and she's so happy." So then here, Bourdain goes into something else that happens about this wife. "Forget the outside world. There is no life other than this life. I didn't spend much time trying to figure it out. The man scared me. Years later, I got another perspective on things. I opened the Post to see a photo of my old boss's wife, draped over the awning of a Chinese restaurant on the Upper East Side. She'd apparently performed a double gainer from the window of her high-rise apartment and not quite made it to the pavement. So I guess she wasn't that happy after all." So his wife killed herself. Not Bourdain's, his boss's. And he makes other references to suicide too. Later on, he goes into talk about one of his good friends who owns his own restaurant, how he fired a guy. And I'll let you know what happens. Here it is. "After a no-show and a late arrival and yet another ugly, histrionic incident of insubordination, my friend had no choice but to fire his cocaine-stoked and deranged employee, telling him, in classic style, to clean out your locker and get the fuck out. The cook went home, made a few phone calls, and then hanged himself. It's a measure of what we do for a living that this kind of a thing could happen, and that my friend, on his next visit to my kitchen, was greeted with gestures of mimed strangulation. Cooks and waiters holding a hand over their heads, sticking their tongues out and rolling their eyes up, tagging my friend to his face as serial killer and remorselessly teasing him." So then Bourdain continues to go on in this chapter about how his friend shouldn't feel so guilty, and this is just something you have to deal with. And Bourdain has a kind of harsh opinion about this, about like, you got to deal with it or not, and if you kill yourself, it's not my fault if I fired you. And it's just so crazy to read a chapter like this knowing that Bourdain hanged himself all the years later. And something else I noticed, I started watching a lot of more highlights and episodes of Parts Unknown and No Reservations while I was still reading this book. And he does make a lot of jokes about death and suicide in those shows, which is crazy. It's almost like, I wonder if he was just crying for help with humor all these years. So this book is super interesting, guys. One of the best, maybe the best book I read all year. If I had to say something I didn't like about it, it's about 300-ish pages long, and within the last 200 pages, the last leg of the book, it starts to feel like it's dragging on a bit. Like, a few of the chapters seem unnecessary. There's a couple chapters, like, he's just talking about his friends and why he likes them and stuff. And it's like, I don't really need to read about your random friend that also owns a restaurant, you know? So I didn't really like those chapters. They didn't do anything for me. But there is one of the last chapters. Mission to Tokyo is one of the best, though. I will say that. It's when he takes a trip to Tokyo, and this is before he was like world traveler Bourdain. You know, basically every country Bourdain. And he goes to Tokyo because he runs a restaurant called Lei Hao. And he goes to the Tokyo Lei Hao. They want him to like see how everything's going, and it's his first time there, and he writes about it. The following night was my last in Tokyo. Felipe took me out to a shabu-shabu joint in Shibuya, Tokyo's Times Square. It was Friday night, and all the painstakingly observed customs and practices of the workday went out the window. The streets were packed with herds of insanely drunk businessmen and teenagers. In Tokyo, it's apparently okay, even de rigueur, to go out with the boss and the boys from the office and get completely, stuttering, out of control drunk. In such circumstances, after a night of drinking and karaoke, it's okay to vomit on your boss's shoes, take a swing at him, call him an asshole. He'll probably throw you over his shoulder and carry you home. Everybody was drunk. Everywhere. Lovely young women brushed the hair of their violently heaving boyfriends' faces, and they leaned on all fours into the gutters. As they leaned on all fours into the gutters. Suit and tied salarymen projectile vomited, lurched, sang, caroused and staggered like bumper cars down the humanity-clogged streets. So he goes on to describe Tokyo, and he's not dissing Tokyo with that. He loves that. And he describes more than just people drinking, but the food and, you know, the massive, you know, sci-fi skyscrapers everywhere. And I've never been to Tokyo, but I used to live in China, and this whole chapter really reminded me of it, and it was amazing to read this. And he goes into how he's falling in love with Southeast Asia. So guys, I really love this book. I highly recommend it. You learn a lot about the restaurant business, as well as just Bourdain himself. So, great book, guys. Recommend it. I'll catch you on the next review. We'll see. I might read another Bourdain book because he wrote a few novels as well. So, we'll see, guys. But keep reading. I'll smell y'all later. Oh, and also, have y'all read this book? If so, what did you think? Did you like it? Did you hate it? Did it do something for you? What was the most memorable chapter for you? Alright guys, so have a good one. Thanks for watching.